Hi everyone, Aubrey here for All Ears English on YouTube. Welcome to the channel. We are so excited to share this episode with you today. Neil Edgeller from BBC Learning English shares his expertise about learning English in the news and using the vocabulary learned in the news in your everyday English. So listen in for his tips and be sure to go to allearsenglish.com/fluency score to get your level in English and free resources. All right, guys, enjoy the interview. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the podcast and welcome to our special guest, Neil. Can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Neil and I work for BBC Learning English, which, as you may know, provides English language teaching programs, videos, materials, online materials for our large audience of international learners of English.
Yes, some of you may recognize Neil's voice if you listen to some of the podcasts he regularly presents on The English We Speak, 6-Minute English, and News Review. So you may follow those, you may listen to those, and so his voice will sound very familiar, which is fun to have you here at All Ears English with us. Thank you for joining us today.
It's lovely to be here. Thanks for
Yes.
having me.
So I'm excited because I feel like you have some great advice for our listeners, especially when it comes to learning English vocabulary through the news. When you're reading news articles and watching things on the news and then finding vocabulary out of that and using it in your everyday English. So I'm hopeful that you can give us some great tips so that our listeners can listen to you there and also start learning more English as they read the news.
Yeah. Yeah, that's something we're really keen on at BBC Learning English is to, obviously we are the BBC, so we have access to a lot of news material, which and interviews with people as well. And we really like to exploit that and to take advantage of authentic English as it's really used by people when they're really speaking, rather than maybe some of the more contrived examples that you might get in certain textbooks or classrooms or whatever. Not wanting to criticize anyone,
Exactly. No, but
but
that's
we've
exactly right, right? If you're looking at it, especially an older textbook, it's scripted conversations that aren't the way we speak anymore. So when you're
yeah.
using as your material the news and the way we actually speak today, it's so much more valuable.
Yeah, and that's what we try to do. So in this 6-minute English podcast that you've already mentioned, we take interesting clips of interviews from people who've appeared usually on BBC radio programs, and we construct a program around that, and we try and explain how that language has been used in that particular context, and what its register is, whether it's formal, informal, and how it's used. When we do news review, which is based on headlines from newspapers, that's a slightly different thing because, as we know, newspaper headlines are not particularly natural English, but they are something that learners will be exposed to quite often. And so it's important that we understand how we can take that language from an authentic context, but then have the knowledge to be able to use it in our real everyday English.
Yes, exactly. All right, I'm excited to get into this. I know our listeners, whether they have listened to your podcast in the past or not, or will start now, I know they're going to be excited about this because everyone wants to stay up on current events. You want to know
Mhm.
what's happening in the news, but you're not getting that much out of it if you're just, reading an article to find out what's happening. Whereas if you're reading it in your second language or a third language, you're killing two birds with one stone because you're also improving your English in this case, learning great vocabulary, but then the trick is to apply it and use it in your everyday English, as you guys
Yeah,
say. So I'm really excited to get some of these tips for that. So let's get
yeah.
into it. Can you share with us sort of the first tip that you would share with our listeners?
Yeah, so I think it's important to know when you read a headline or you see a story, not just what the word means. There's a lot to what something means rather than what you just find in a dictionary. And what we try to do in News Review is to give that context, um, to discuss what, to use jargon, collocations there are. So which words go together around that particular word or expression, how formal it is, how appropriate it is in certain situations, how common it is. You know, there are words that are used in headlines which we'd never say. You know, I'm trying to think of an example now, but there's a certain here's a term for the listeners: journalese, a type of journalistic language which is used in headlines, but which isn't really the way that we speak. So you might see in a British sort of tabloid newspaper, perhaps, that somebody slammed someone, meaning criticized heavily. Now, we would never say that, but you see that kind of language all the time. And so it's important to know, I think, as a learner, what you can use,
Do
what's
we really
natural.
say this?
Do we
Right.
really say it? What does that stand for? Why is it used? You know, often it's because the headline is short, and the headline
Right.
writers need to get all of that information into a short space.
I can think of a great example in your most recent news review podcast about Harry and Meghan's interview.
Hmm.
And you talked about the word salvo. And
Yeah.
it's a really good point that, okay, do we actually use this, and what's the context? And because
Yeah.
it's true, as a native speaker,
Hmm.
we sort of know intuitively. And when we're learning a second, third language, we need to learn that. We need to know, how do natives really use this? I want to
Mm.
sound native. I want to sound natural.
Mm.
And so we need to know that context and the collocations. Yeah.
Yeah. And what really strikes me every time, really, that I do news review, and I've been doing it for a long time now.
How
Um,
long have you been
it
doing it? Can I ask?
Well, yeah, probably about 5 years now.
Okay.
News
Yeah.
review, that particular program.
Nice.
But what really strikes me about the language that we cover is that how much figurative language there is used. So,
Yes.
like salvo, I've forgotten what there was a bombshell in that.
Bombshell.
You know, there's so much figurative language. And it was all kind of military in that particular program. So, what I would say to learners is that you might think you know what a bombshell is or a salvo is, because it might be similar, especially if it's a Latin language with, which cognates.
Right. Yes.
You may think that you know it, but it's always worth watching these types of programs, and listening to what we have to say, because we try to explain some of the nuances and how it's often used figuratively. The example was a bombshell announcement, I think. Now,
Mhm.
obviously, it's not. There's no real bomb. Nothing is really exploding. But in a figurative sense, it was a very destructive interview that was given, and this happens week in, week out. The amount of figurative language that is there, and I'm sure it's the same in all languages, but it's something that will really help you broaden your vocabulary to have that knowledge.
Yes, definitely. And if your listeners out there aren't aware of the word salvo, because that is pretty new, you can check out this last episode of News Review. It means a sudden multiple releases of something. And it is interesting when it's used to talk about something other than like a military,
Mm.
salvo of bullets,
Yeah.
because there is that intonation of something sort of militaristic,
Mm.
right?
Mm.
So, yeah, it's interesting, all of that deeper context, some of the hidden meaning that is used in headlines and in the news sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, what would be the second tip that you would share with us?
Second tip would be to really immerse yourself, expose yourself to as much um, content, articles, videos as you can. I know it's not always easy. People are busy. They only have a limited amount of time for study, but it really pays off if you can spare that time to immerse yourself, to talk figuratively again. Excuse me.
No problem.
To immerse yourself in English uh, content, but by
Yes.
which I mean films, TV, radio, podcasts, and the kind of stuff that we produce, then you're going to get better just from that exposure, and then trying to use it.
Yes, we're so lucky to have, the internet and so much film and TV and things at our fingertips that when I first started learning a second language, my option was to go to the library and find
Hmm.
books in French and Spanish and maybe a DVD in
Hmm.
Spanish. Now there's so much that it's true that our only limit is our time, and carving out that time and then
Hmm.
making sure, are you going to watch that in your first language or challenge yourself? and
Hmm.
try to listen to or watch something in your second language. And you're right, when
Hmm.
you immerse yourself, just like when you're living in a country that speaks that language as their first language, that is when real learning happens and you start
Hmm.
progressing so fast.
Yeah, yeah.
Awesome. Okay, what about a third tip?
I would say I would say be kind to yourself as a
Nice.
learner, because it's really, everybody knows it's really, really frustrating and hard learning a language. And I think we need to be honest with ourselves about that. You know, it's a long, slow process, and no matter what uh, catchy advertising you might see around language learning, you have to, at some stage you have to study, and it takes a while, but it is so rewarding. So if you're having a hard time and you're thinking you're getting nowhere, don't give yourself a hard time, because if you keep at it, you will improve.
I love that advice. Yes, be kind to yourself because it is difficult and it's so easy to get discouraged. And then it's, easy to sort of stop trying. But if you can be kind to yourself and recognize the little steps that you're making, recognize the improvement instead of focusing on the difficult things, then you'll keep trying, you'll keep progressing. And that's the goal, right?
Hmm. That's right.
What about
Yeah.
you,
And
Neil? Do you speak any other languages?
I have attempted to master several languages, but I've never really got that proficient, let's
Dabbled?
say.
You've dabbled at several?
No, I've studied Spanish. I studied some Czech language. I worked in the Czech Republic. I worked in Japan. So the places that I've been, I've tried to do as well as I can. And it's really rewarding, isn't it? When you get to a stage where you can have a conversation with someone, you feel proud of yourself, and you should.
Yes, that's exactly right. I've started using the app Clubhouse for language practice because they have these rooms where you can practice languages, and I'm loving it because I don't have that many opportunities to practice French or Spanish speaking in my
Hmm.
daily life, other than myself in the mirror, which is also
Yeah,
helpful. But it's
that's it.
so
That's a decent technique.
Yes, I know it's not bad, right? We improve for sure.
Yeah.
But to get to that place where you can actually have this conversation with another person in
Mm,
that language is so rewarding. Like you said, you're able to make those connections. We say
yeah.
this all the time here at Allers English. That's our motto is connection, not perfection. And
Hmm.
that is the goal, to make that connection with another person in another language. It's so exciting.
Yeah. And ultimately, what is the aim of speaking a language? It's to communicate, isn't it? And if you make
Exactly.
some mistakes while you're doing that, but people understand what you're saying, then that's okay.
That's okay, right? That's the goal. You're making that connection. I love it. Exactly. When you were in these other countries, were you working as a journalist at the time, or was that before you got into broadcast
No, I
journalism?
was I was teaching English,
Oh, nice.
and then I went into journalism, and now what I do kind of combines the two.
Yes, right. It's a perfect marriage of both. I love
That's
it.
right.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. This was so interesting. I am very excited for our listeners to check out your podcasts, all of the podcasts at BBC Learning English, but especially those that you present on, of course. Can
Yes,
you
thank you
share
very much.
where can our listeners find your podcast and the information about BBC Learning English?
Yeah, sure. So we have a website, bbclearningenglish.com. We also have a free app, which you can find on the Apple Store and on Google Play. We have podcasts that you can get from all the usual places.
Yep.
And we are all over social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube.
Yes.
BBC Learning English. If you search for us, you'll find us.
Yes, and I noticed you have like quizzes and activities as well about the podcast on news review, which there's so much value to that, to be able to have a check for understanding. Like, now I've learned this, let me
Mhm.
quiz myself, do an activity, and then move on and apply it in your everyday English, right?
Yeah, yeah, it's important, as we know, to test yourself on what you've learned, and also to revisit it fairly soon after you've learnt what you've attempted to learn. As we know, you've got to come back to it. You've got to revisit it. You've got to revise, because then it'll start to stick.
Exactly, right? If forget it after, or just stop using it after a couple of days, it doesn't stick. You won't be able to use it in a natural conversation and have it come
Hmm.
up. So it
Hmm.
does take that practice, right? Being really aware of, having it in the same place where you can review it, revisit it, like you said, and then intentionally use it in conversation so that it becomes a part of your natural vocabulary.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you so much again for joining us. This has
You're
been
welcome.
really fun. And your listeners can hear more of Neil's wonderful British accent and wonderful voice on his podcast.
Thank you
All
very
right.
much. I
Thanks
look forward
again.
to you joining us.
Yes, definitely. Have a great day. Bye.